Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Dan and Joe Sports Show. As always, I'm Dan.
And I'm Joe.
All right, Joe, we're going to pick up with our rest of our games of the week for the first week of the college football season. We did our locks of the week. I had Colorado State at plus 30 and a half against Michigan. And in one of the games of the week, you had Oregon covering at 17 and a half against Georgia. Joe, Arkansas, believe it or not, is favored by 6.5 points this game against Cincinnati, who made the college football playoff last year. I think this is a neutral site game, if I'm not mistaken. And I think this is a real exciting game. You look at what Cincinnati is going to be without their all-star quarterback that's now playing for the Falcons. Of course, without the Mike Ford, the transfer running back from Alabama, and we see how does Cincinnati come back from what is the greatest season a group of five team has, and also how does Arkansas continue on the success that they had last year, where they won 9 games, where they beat Texas A&M. They finished the season by beating a very good Penn State team in a bowl game, and I think this is going to be a really exciting matchup to see which of these ascending programs is going to yet again just keep on rising up. Yeah, Joe. I mean, what do you think about how this is going to go?
I think it's a really interesting matchup. I think it's the one of the best games that nobody's really talking about enough. And I think when you look at Cincinnati, my question for them is I wonder if the ranking is based more on what they did last year compared to what's coming back. That's kind of my question. Like, I want to see, I talked about Georgia having new starters, Cincinnati, a lot of new faces in different positions. So I want to see how they look and who are the stars on this team. For Arkansas, I want to see how Jefferson and the offense looks, without the receiver that was drafted by the Titans, Traylon
Oh,
Burks.
Marshall.
Also, just want to see how Jefferson looks in general because I've been on record saying that he's one of my favorite quarterbacks in the SEC to watch outside of Bryce Young. And I really think that Arkansas is building something pretty special with Sam Pittman. And I want to see if they can go out and win this game and, catapult the rest of the season.
Well, Joe, if Arkansas wants to reach what I think their fans probably want, which is for them to be the second best team in the SEC West this year, they got to go out and win this game. Cincinnati's a very good team. They've shown a lot of improvement over the years, but you're still supposed to have better talent than Cincinnati does. And we saw in the college football playoff last year when they played Alabama, I mean, Cincinnati did not have anywhere near the kind of athletes that Alabama had. And Arkansas is still an SEC team, and they have a lot of returning talent from KJ Jefferson, a really good, solid dual threat quarterback. Jalen Catalon, who's probably the best safety in the SEC, returning for another year. I thought he was a guy that maybe would have been a first round draft pick last year. And then they've got a transfer wide receiver from Oklahoma and Jadon Hazelwood, who I think when he came out of high school was the number one overall wide receiver. So there's definitely some talent there at Arkansas. And this is a game that they should win. But let me say this, Joe. I've already put my lock of the week out here. If I were going to have a second one, I might consider taking Cincinnati on the money line here. This is a very fascinating game to me, seeing that Arkansas is favored by 6.5. I would have thought this was closer to a pick 'em.
I'm probably going to shock a lot of people. I do like Arkansas to cover. I think they're going to win this by 10 to 15 points. Like I said, I'm excited to see how Cincinnati fares, but at the same time, I'm also skeptical with all the players they lost to the next level. Whereas Arkansas, I really feel like this could be a momentum boosting win for their team.
Okay. Well, we'll see, Joe. If they can go out and do what you say, then watch out for Arkansas the rest of the season.
Right.
All right, Joe. Our next one we have, this is a real show me game. We had Utah listed in our top 5 at number 4. A lot of what everybody's hearing about Utah is based on what they did last season. They trounced Oregon twice. Really talented teams by Cristobal, with Mario Cristobal, and then of course in the Sugar Bowl, in the Rose Bowl, they played Ohio State really tough, and what was probably maybe the best bowl game we saw all season. Just lick for lick, great offense. And ultimately, they lost in what was an amazing performance by C.J. Stroud, and even more impressive by Jackson Smith and Jigba. I think he almost had 300 receiving yards himself. The question is, Joe, how much do I read into them playing what I said earlier was Ohio State's B team? I mean, Ohio State, I think, had over 10 players opt out of that game. Is this Utah team for real a top 5 team? Well, we're going to know when they take on Florida this weekend. They got to travel to the Swamp for Billy Napier's first game, and what's not going to be a super talented Florida team, but what is going to be one that's going to be very excited. And one thing I've known from watching Auburn play down in Florida and watching teams travel there, it is a very difficult place to play. It's very hot. That's going to be something Utah is going to have to get used to. Florida fans are intense. They don't travel very well, but for home games, Florida fans they're loud. They get after you. They've got it set up to where the students are right behind the away team's bench. So Utah is probably going to hear things said to them they've never heard said to them in a Pac-12 game. So if they're a real top 5 team, they're going to have to go out and handle business in what is going to be a very hostile atmosphere down in the Swamp.
Right. I mean, this is a tough game to be breaking in a preseason, top 5 college football playoff, hopeful season. Like, this is really a nightmare scenario when you take into that calculation. So I think Florida has a really good chance to all of your great points to pull off this upset. And if I'm Utah, I'm really nervous about this game.
I am too, Joe, because, the Pac-12's had some epic defeats. Actually, a lot of them to Auburn, frankly. The Pac-12's just had a rough time with Auburn, really, when you think about the SEC, because they haven't had a whole lot of other opportunities. Of course, Oregon twice in the 2010 national championship game, 2019 season opener, Washington. These are all teams that had either top 10 or top 5. Oregon lost to LSU in a game where I think it was the year after they lost to Auburn, where Oregon was top 5 and played one of these opening games. Didn't turn out well for them. But, Joe, I think all of those were ones where they were acceptable losses. Of course, you look at the national championship game, Oregon and Auburn, really great game. Auburn was the better team. No one disputed that. Auburn was favored. LSU was favored over Oregon in that game. They lost. Auburn was barely favored in the Bo Nix to Seth Williams game. Auburn was favored in the, Washington-Auburn game. Those are all ones where, it was acceptable for them to lose those games. They thought they had a good chance, and they were all, teams that were worthy, but they all led to this narrative about the Pac-12. Joe, this would be horrible for the Pac-12 if they lost this game. This Florida team, it's got all new faces. It's not what we're used to seeing with Florida. Utah is their shining light this year in a team that's gotten rated by the Big Ten. They've lost USC and UCLA. If Utah doesn't win this game, this could really be like the end of the Pac-12 ever having a chance at making the college football playoff.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a nightmarish situation in the making. It would just be awful to lose to Napier in his debut for Florida. And, quite frankly, I could see a scenario where it happens. I could see a scenario where Utah loses this game, maybe, still even wins the Pac-12, but this loss pretty much, disqualifies them from the playoff.
Oh, absolutely. If they lose this game, they have no chance of making the playoff. And to be honest, Joe, where Florida right now is as a program, I think that Utah has to win this game by double digits to even be considered to make the college football playoff.
I think a win would be enough, but I can't see like them go out there, and just win a defensive game. Like, I gotta see, I guess, some style points too.
Joe, I'm going to give Utah just the slightest edge in this. I do think they win this game because this Florida team, they don't have a whole lot for me. And they didn't show me anything at all last year. They got a lot of new faces. I know Billy Napier is a master recruiter, but I think Florida finished with the worst recruiting class outside of Vanderbilt in the SEC. So he doesn't make that big of a move in his first season. And I think Utah is going to win a game, maybe something like 24-21. But I like them to win a tight one and probably just barely cover.
Yeah, I can see that where they win a game and, you're kind of, wondering, is the hype, for real the rest of the season?
Yeah, because I just think that I don't think they're good enough to deal with all the things that I said that make this such a trap game. And Joe, trust me, I've thought in my mind 100 times about picking Florida to win this game based on everything I threw out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right, Joe. Next, we have West Virginia and Pittsburgh on Thursday night. This is one that I just think is interesting because it's the backyard brawl coming back. One of the classic rivalries in college football. A lot of hate there. The city of Pittsburgh and Morgantown, West Virginia, is very close to each other. They both have that kind of like working class miners, mindset, just real blue collar programs. This game wasn't that long ago. About 15 years ago, decided who was going to play in the national championship. West Virginia with Pat White, local hero out of Daphne, Alabama. Steve Sladen at running back. Rich Rod had those guys one game away from playing for the national championship. Pitt was a team that I think was barely going to a bowl game. And in this really heated, hate filled rivalry, Pittsburgh beat West Virginia and ended their chances of playing in their only national championship game ever.
Yeah, no, I remember that just like it was yesterday, and just one of those games, that had such an impact on that season. We always kind of reference it, and I'm glad to see this backyard brawl rivalry back with another installment that was lost, with conference realignment. I'm really intrigued to see Slovis this year with Pitt because, while they're replacing receivers, at the same time, I think Slovis is a really good quarterback, and I do think the defense they return is pretty stout.
Yeah, Joe, I think Pittsburgh is going to be good this year. I think Pat Narduzzi has built just an excellent program that keeps getting better there. And I think one that's built for sustained success as long as they stay in the ACC. And what I really find fascinating about this game is that you're going to have two former USC quarterbacks starting against each other, and JT Daniels at West Virginia, with JT Daniels playing for his 18th school while he's been in college. And of course, Keaton Slovis, who was USC starter there for a little bit a couple years ago. And, I like Pittsburgh in this game pretty big. And I look for them to, definitely be one of the front runners in the ACC this year.
I think so. I agree.
All right, Joe. Another game we got on Thursday night that's interesting to me is Penn State going to Purdue to take on the Spoilermakers. Penn State is fresh off a season where they had a lot of hype to begin with. They beat Auburn in a game that I was at that was just an excellent atmosphere. And then when Sean Clifford, who was having a great season, got injured, Penn State went downhill. I think that they saw that James Franklin has done a great job at building a program. They rewarded him by giving him a huge extension, even though he had 2 seasons in a row that were not great by Penn State standards. Well, Purdue comes off a season last year where they went 9-4. They beat 2 top 5 teams and were really just amazing in these games against opponents that they shouldn't have played with. Well, Penn State, they're a team that's got a lot of hype this season. A lot of people think that outside of Ohio State, they're probably the best team in the Big Ten. Well, if they're the second best team in the Big Ten, then they've got to go to Lafayette, Indiana, and win this game. And this is a tough road trip, man.
It really is. There's even some peripheral hype for Purdue in the Big Ten West this year to make a run in that division. And so it's not an easy game at all. I think Penn State has a good chance to win, but I think it's really hard anytime you see a team opening up against a conference opponent to start your season,
especially on the road. And when it comes to Purdue, one thing they're able to do against good football teams last year, even ones that have really solid defenses, like when they beat Michigan State and Iowa, is Aiden O'Connell is an excellent quarterback. I think he's one of the top 5 quarterbacks out there in college football this year. And when he played the best defenses, he played his best football. And so I look for this to be a game that Penn State is not going to be able to win in their usual slobber knocker fashion, like 13-10 or anything like that. If they're going to beat this Purdue bunch, they're going to have to score upwards of 24 to 28 points, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then the other fascinating story with Penn State, they're one of those teams that has a 5-star quarterback waiting in the wings. And so interesting to see how Morgan looks all season.
That's right, Joe. With that being said, I do think Penn State wins this game. I think they've got a lot of talent, and I think that James Franklin is going to get things righted for this team early in the season. But I do think this is going to be an excellent football game, and I look to Penn State to win in a 1-score game, maybe something like 30-28, something like that.
Yeah, just hard to fathom it being a blowout by any stretch of the imagination.
Absolutely, Joe. And before we get to the coup de grace game, that being Notre Dame at Ohio State, let's talk about one that in a lot of seasons would have been the main draw of this opening weekend. That would have been a game that you and I were like, salivating over. And maybe 10 years ago, it definitely would have been. And that's LSU taking on Florida State in New Orleans. I mean, Joe, like, can you believe that's not the main draw based on the history of college football? But it just tells you where LSU and Florida State is. I mean, they're both teams that within the last 10 years have won a national championship. Yet those national championships seem like distant memories based on what's happened with both those programs lately.
No, absolutely. I completely concur with that. And my synopsis on this game is when you're looking at the scoreboard for this weekend, if you check like the ESPN app, because it's not a top 25 matchup, like the game doesn't even pull up that quickly on the scoreboard. And so like I was looking at it trying to remember, isn't there a Sunday night college game this weekend? And then I was like, oh, it's LSU Florida State, but they're not ranked. And so just a matchup that previously historically would have been so hyped. Quite frankly, I cannot give you any analysis about Florida State. With LSU, I obviously know about Brian Kelly and Jaden Daniels, but for me, Florida State this year really don't know much about them.
Well, Joe, this is such an interesting game to me because Florida State comes in, their coach is hanging on by the hair of his chinny chin chin right now. He hasn't been the kind of success we thought he would be coming from Memphis. And this is a big opportunity for him. It's Brian Kelly's very first game with LSU. They had so many players transfer out, like all of their best players basically left LSU. Brian Kelly's assembled an entirely new team. I mean, we know he's one of the best coaches in college football, but you got to think that Florida State, if they were ever going to get LSU, this is the time to get them. And Florida State also has one other advantage over LSU in that Florida State played last week. They played a cakewalk game against Duquesne where they got to get a lot of their errors out of them. And the biggest thing is like, how much is their offensive line improved? Because Joe, you and I've been joking on the show for 3 years about the fact that there's high schools in Alabama and Mississippi that have had better offensive lines than Florida State. And that could be the question. Has Florida State improved that much in that area that even a depleted LSU has always had a great defensive line? Is the quarterback going to be in trouble a lot when he's going back in the pocket?
Mm-hmm. No, that's certainly a legitimate question. And really, I mean, because of where both teams stand, it's hard for me to get a read on this game. I've been on record saying with Brian Kelly, I think he's an excellent coach, but I just don't know if this is going to be a fit long term. And just at some point, with the strength of the SEC West, somebody's got to lose. And so, that's the tough thing for him through the rest of the season. But as far as this game, it's really hard for me to make a prediction.
Yeah, it's a tough one, Joe. I'm actually going to take Florida State on this one. I think that they got to have some of the pregame jitters out last week. I think that they're going to be very motivated for this game. I think that, LSU has lost so many players. I think Jaden Daniels is a guy that is, yet again, part of that class of quarterbacks from 3 years ago that never really seemed to materialize with Bo Nix, Sam Howell, and Jaden Daniels. And, you go down the list. And I just don't think that he's really met his height. And I think that this game is so important to Florida State and to their coach that I think they're going to play well. And like I said, I think that them having that game last week, I think makes a big difference. And I like Florida State in a close game here.
I'll give LSU the edge with it being in New Orleans.
And that's the one thing, Joe, that makes me nervous about my pick is the fact that it's in New Orleans, because I know it's going to be, Florida State fans do travel well. They are a very well traveling fan base, but you still got to think it's probably going to be an 80-20 split, at least with LSU fans.
Right, exactly.
All right, Joe, the last game that we have, of course, the penultimate game of the weekend, maybe, could be one of the best openers we've had in college football in recent memory, and that's Notre Dame traveling to the Horseshoe to take on Ohio State, who most people are picking to win the national championship this year. It's been Marcus Freeman's first regular season game as the head coach. Of course, he filled in as the interim last season when Notre Dame took on Oklahoma State, and for 3 quarters and a half did a very good job until Oklahoma State came back. Uh, Marcus Freeman played football at Ohio State, so it's a homecoming for him. And just a really fascinating game, Joe. But, I'm saying all these things, and Ohio State is still favored by 17 and a half points.
And I think that's about accurate. Like, for me, the question is, how close can Notre Dame keep this game? I just think that, with Notre Dame breaking in new quarterback play, with, just having a new staff, I think that Ohio State just has such a decided advantage offensively with the chemistry that they have already with Stroud and some of these young receivers that got to play in the Rose Bowl. And for me, the question all year, as I referenced earlier, is Ohio State has the offense that's so good. How good is their defense going to play to complement that? Last year, that's really what made the difference in them not making the playoff and not beating Michigan, one of the big reasons, in my opinion. And so I want to see how the defense looks for Ohio State in this matchup.
Well, Joe, I can say this. They certainly went out and got maybe the best defensive coordinator in the country in Jim Knowles from Oklahoma State. I mean, he did such a great thing with the Cowboys. And I mean, you looked at them last year, and they were one of the top 5 best defenses in all of college football. And he, of course, is completely, he's got a completely different set of cutlery in his kitchen when we're talking about what he gets at Ohio State versus Oklahoma State in terms of talent. And I think Ohio State's defense is going to be vastly improved this year. I'm not going to sit here and say they're going to have a top 10 defense, but it may be a top 30 defense, which with their collection of offensive talent is really all they need. And so, Joe, I look for Notre Dame to have a decent amount of success offensively. But to be honest, I think Ohio State's going to be able to score at will. I mean, I think that Notre Dame's had a very good defense. Marcus Freeman obviously was a great defensive coordinator for him last year. But this Ohio State offense is just a machine. I mean, you're talking about 5-star excellent receivers all over the place. Marvin Harrison's son is someone that's barely being mentioned. Jackson Smith-Njigba is a possible Heisman Trophy candidate at wide receiver. Henderson at running back is amazing. C.J. Stroud is the Heisman Trophy favorite at quarterback. I think that this is going to be a game that's going to have a lot of points. I'm not what you would usually think of with the Notre Dame game. And I think you're right. I think the line's probably about right. Just because I think that Notre Dame's gonna put a lot of effort in, I'm gonna give them just the slightest edge on the line. But I think I like Ohio State to win this one 41-24.
Okay. And I'll also add, with this Ohio State offense, I think this is going to be the type of nucleus with Stroud and company that teenagers that are growing up today, they're going to look back at this team and think of it kind of like we look at USC with like Leinart and Bush and Dwayne Jarrett. Like, this is going to be one of just like the glamorous offenses of this generation.
Let's put it this way, Jay. You're talking about the glamour of this offense. C.J. Stroud is so highly thought of, and as I said, a Heisman Trophy favorite, that in this age of NIL, he has been given a free Maserati to drive around. Apparently, there's some amazing antique, car warehouse outside of Columbus, Ohio, that has all these amazing, immaculate cars that are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. And they have chosen CJ Stroud to where it's like every week you can go and pick up a Maserati or a Rolls Royce or whatever he wants to do and just drive it around to advertise for him. And that's what this offense that he has is. It's a James Bond car. It's everything you'd ever want. It's just beautifulness. And he's got it all at his disposal. And the rest of college football is going to have to deal with it this season.
And who else, would be able to say that without Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave? Like, to me, that's just so baffling when you think about it.
Well, and we talked about Utah earlier. I mean, that was on display against Utah with all these players opted out. Their number one, their number two guys out at wide receiver. Jackson Smith-Njigba goes out and almost gets 300 yards himself.
Mm-hmm. It's
and
unbelievable.
It's amazing. So I think that, Ohio State, I think Notre Dame made the good decision by, holding on to this really young stellar coach and Marcus Freeman. I think he's going to have him good eventually. And I think he's definitely maybe going to be a better recruiter even than Brian Kelly was. But this is a tough test for his very first game. And I think Ohio State's going to beat him by 17 plus.
I can see it.
All right. And with that being said, we hope that you tune in for at least 17 plus more episodes of us. We've been liking all the viewership lately. You can catch all of our episodes on Spotify. And over the last few months, our YouTube channel, you can subscribe to it, the Dan and Joe Sports Show YouTube channel. We also recently just got on Instagram. So you can look us up, the Dan and Joe Sports Show on Instagram. And as always, I'm Dan.
And I'm Joe.